Welcome. I'm Candace Roberts from Historic Gloria Dei, and we are joined this evening by Amy Grant, a member of our board on Historic Gloria Dei and a phenomenal history buff, and Michael Schreiber, also a member of our Historic Gloria Dei board and a published author of a number of history books and lecturer. Recently gave a wonderful walking tour of Queen Village twice. So we're looking forward to more walking tours in the spring. And local historian and professional tour guide, Jim Murphy. Welcome, Jim. And Reverend Dr. Kim Eric Williams, who is a board member emeritus from Historic Gloria Dei, also a governor in the Swedish Colonial Society, and a Lutheran minister who sometimes preaches at Gloria Dei Church. So Kim Eric has been a longtime friend to us at Gloria Dei. So welcome to all of you. You are invited to put your questions into the question window, but to get us started, I have some warm-up questions to present to our panel. And I'm going to start with Amy and Michael. So this was a question from our last Ask Us Anything panel, and we didn't have an answer at the time, but now we have figured that out. Are there graves under I-95?
Okay, if you like, it was directed to Amy and I, and I'll begin, okay? Well, yes, that was presented several months ago when we had another panel, and subsequently, Amy and I looked further into the question. At the time, we didn't think so. At this time, we're more convinced that there's no evidence for any graves under I-95. The only source might be the fact that the Bethel Mariners Church was on the east side of Front Street and was torn down in around 1967, and that at one point had graves around it, and who knows if they were ever taken up. But as far as Gloria Dei, it doesn't appear that any extension of the churchyard was on the land under I-95. However, there was an auxiliary burial ground just on the west side of Front Street in the area which is next to the Spark Shot Tower, and it's the playing fields section of the adjacent playground. And that area was part of the vast land holdings of the church throughout most of the 18th century, and some were subdivided into farms and so forth, but that area was reserved, was owned by the church, and we think, Amy and I, that there's a good chance that with the yellow fever epidemics of 1797 and 98, that the room for burials in the churchyard itself were somewhat constricted, and more deceased people were coming in at all hours of the night, you might think. And so they opened up that ground for additional burials, perhaps some even without coffins. And it was later taken over by the descendants who owned the Spark Shot Tower, used for industrial purposes, and then the city took it over and made it a playground. Supposedly the bodies were removed. We haven't been able to determine yet where, But even in recent times, people have mentioned finding bone fragments there. So we don't really know. And I'll finish in a second, but in 1907, for example, there were still 3 gravestones that were appearing, the tips of which appeared above the ground of the playfield, and they were excavated further, and the inscriptions were still legible. So just fairly recently, we did some more research into the people that were buried there. One was Elizabeth Snell, the wife of a sea captain, James Snell, and we looked into those people particularly and wrote about it. And I think their story should be on the website of the Preserve Gloria Dei Corporation, so you can read more.
So Michael, are you saying that when that was used as a burial ground, there were markers there, and were these deeded plots, or do you think it was more haphazard than that, or what?
We haven't found much information about that, just a few references to people who were buried around that time, and some of whom were denoted as strangers, which these 3 markers, the people buried there were strangers. And strangers meant different things at different times, but generally it was people who are not Lutherans.
Okay.
So we don't, they are in the book of, there are other strangers in the burial records of Gloria Dei, but we don't know yet whether they were buried in the major churchyard or in this auxiliary one.
Okay, great.
There's a real uptick in if you look at the burial records, there's a real uptick in 1797. I mean, there are a couple of strangers before that. There are not very many, but starting in 1797, it's just name, stranger, stranger, stranger. And we cross-reference those names against there's an official publication that lists all the people who died of yellow fever, and all of those names are in there pretty much. So that's why
we have a designation. Why does Gloria Dei call them strangers? There's a reason, right? They weren't congregants?
Well, I'm not really, I mean, perhaps Dr. Williams can weigh in on this, but I think initially, there were 2 stranger sections. One of them basically where the memorial garden is today. And that was it looks like that was for people who were Lutherans, but who weren't members of Gloria Dei. And then what we see in 1797 is this other auxiliary yard is being used for people who died of yellow fever, and they're called strangers. But I mean, I don't think it mattered what their, what their affiliation was. I mean, the epidemic in 1797 was so vast, especially in Southwark in our neighborhood, that the sexton notes in the burial records that there are so many burials that he can't keep up. He didn't get all the names. That's how many there was. He was constantly digging, and putting bodies in. But Dr. Williams, is that accurate? Did we have to?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. The pandemic really changed the regulations. I mean, in the beginning, you had to be a loyal member of Gloria Dei, or you were not allowed to be buried there. Not only were you not allowed to be buried there, but they would not ring the bell either, which was a severe penalty.
Wow.
Because that penalty was calling the congregation to the worship service and was more or less pushing the corpse into the next reality, so to speak. So that, I mean, they would threaten people that if you don't keep up with your pledge to the pastor's salary, you're not going to be able to be buried in the churchyard, and there won't be any bell for you.
Didn't we also have a thing called pew rents or something like that? Didn't you have an assessment for
Yeah, there were pew rents, and then there was also a subscription to the pastor's salary, because the regular offerings were basically for benevolences, and they were minute. So that it was basically an annual pew rent, which usually went from family to family to family, and that wasn't a very high amount. And then there was a subscription to be paid for the pastor's salary, but getting people to pay it was another question.
Right. So, okay. Well, thank you so much for that. Jim, let's have a question for you. What did Philadelphia look like when William Penn arrived in 1682?
Well, it looked different from what I thought it did, what I had read before. And that is that I expected Philadelphia to be farmland and relatively flat farmland. And I found out later that it was not that at all. And we know that one of the oldest Swedes talked about the Great Forest at Philadelphia. And obviously Philadelphia is just north of Gloria Dei. I know one report said it was 2 musket shots from Gloria Dei. So it was pretty close. And when William Penn came, there were approximately 4 tiny buildings near Penn's Landing, near the tavern where he right near where he landed at Dock Street. And according to Francis Daniel Pastorius, that was it. The rest of it was a howling wilderness. And he talked about the fact that he came over on a ship with a baker named Cornelius Baum, and Baum lived at 3rd and Walnut or 3rd and Chestnut, I forget which. And Pastorius couldn't find him again because it wasn't that easy to find your way through a forest, and it was a forest. So it's very different than I had thought all my life until I started doing more research.
Interesting. Thank you. We are taking questions from all of our attendees, so I encourage all of you to put something into the question area. And I do have a question from Anne. In 2019, I was told Gloria Dei's church records were being digitized. When and how might the images be accessed? So, Kim Eric, do you think this is separate from the blue books that are finally published?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes, it's a different project. There's something called Philadelphia Congregations, which is taking all of the colonial records of all the denominations, Jewish and Christian, in Philadelphia in colonial times, and they will all eventually be available online for free. We're hoping that the Gloria Dei ones will be delayed a little till we sell all of our blue books.
Well, I have bad news for you on that front.
We might have to twist a few limbs to make sure they don't start putting them on already, but they will eventually be available that way. And I think there's a few congregations that were that dropped out, or they weren't dropped out, they weren't considered, I guess, so that they still have to add them in. So not all of them are quite there yet. But I would say within 5 or 6 years, they will all be online and they will be free.
Now, the Gloria Dei records, are they going to be substantially what we have published in what we call the blue books? Or are they?
I believe so.
Because they're the same or different?
Well, the problem is that the original Gloria Dei books were lost. Nicholas Collin, the last Swedish rector, referred to the early records and quoted from them. But after he died, they went someplace we don't know where. So they've had to all be reconstructed from other documents. So really, if at some point those things resurface, that will really be helpful to us and enable us to add in things. But as far as we know, what's in the blue books is the only thing available.
So for those of you who may not know what the blue books are that we're talking about, this is a colonial records project. Michael is holding up one, Kim Eric is holding up one, and there are 7 volumes and but a total of 9 books, which are currently on sale for $10 a book. And then I think, Kim Eric, isn't the whole set $50?
That's correct, with postage.
So yes, no free shipping. So they're available now at this super low cost, but someone is also welcome to visit Gloria Dei, make an appointment, and you can look at them as if you were in a library. So we're happy to make them available to whoever wants to peruse them, but they are available. And I think that would lead into, I think, one of your questions.
Can I
Yep.
add to that? So this project that you're talking about, oh my gosh, the scanning of these materials and putting them online, that was through a grant that Christ Church Preservation Trust and a bunch of other 501(c)(3)s put in for and got. So what happens now is if you go to Philadelphia, I'm not part of this project, by the way, I'm just reporting what I've seen. If you go to Philadelphia congregations.org.com, you can flip through the digital books, like, you know, like a flip book thing. So you can see the pages, you can see the handwriting. But in the case of Gloria Dei, all the materials are up there. But when you flip through these books, you're going to realize that, you know, when people were writing in them, they would sometimes write something on this page, skip 50 pages, and then continue the narrative there. So it's not in an order where it's necessarily easy to find information. And that's another reason why the blue books are so valuable, because everything in the blue books has been reconstructed in chronological order. So it's a real boon for somebody like me who's trying to do research. I could pull out volume 2, find what I'm looking for quickly and easily, and know that I'm looking at research that was done on these original sources. So
these original sources, Amy, they are in Swedish generally, is that right?
some of them are in
Whereas
Swedish.
they're translated in the blue books?
Yes, that's correct, right, Dr. Williams?
Yes, that's correct.
But even in the volumes that are in English, if you flip around those books, you're going to find that, you know, like I said, a narrative there might be some notes about something on one page, and then you won't get to the rest of the story for another, you know, 40 pages, right? So that's what makes this, for me, a particularly valuable tool, that I don't have to keep flipping around to find what I'm looking for. I could just pull out volume, you know, one of those volumes and get the whole story right there.
Plus the extensive indexes.
Yes.
You know, in 7A and 7B, there's over 200 pages of indexes.
Okay.
So if you're looking for a relative, you just put the name in and you have them.
Yeah.
And then one final comment on the digitizing project. I think there is sort of a small army of volunteers who are transcribing those scanned images so that they become a little bit easier to search and do research with. So right now, I think there's a lot of just flat JPEGs up there. And and now people like Jeanette, who was going to join us tonight, but unfortunately became ill and mildly ill, but enough that she couldn't join us. But she's one of those volunteers. So it's an exciting project. I do have a follow-up from Anne, and then I have a question from Patrick. So Anne's question is, are the blue books transcriptions? Would a marriage record in 1795 still be available in the original handwriting?
Maybe yes and maybe no. It depends on the situation. Some were not gathered from materials owned by the church, but were gathered from burial records, were gathered from birth records, land transfers, all sorts of other things. So it's not necessarily true that the original written documentation is available.
Great. Okay. But I'll say, Anne, if you are interested in having us follow up on that, just send an email to preserveoldswedes@gmail.org, and we'll see what else we can find out. Okay. I have a question from Patrick. Where exactly was the blockhouse that preceded the church building? Did Gloria Dei have a dock or a wharf on the river in the 1600s and 1700s?
Well, we do know where the blockhouse was. It was under the south porch of Gloria Dei, that transept. So it was located there. And because it was there and the graveyard was there, that's why the church got erected there at the same location. There was considerable controversy about whether it should be there. Some wanted to have it at Passyunk, but the decision was finally made to have it where the cemetery was. And later in the 18th century, then St. James and King's Essing was built for those people who were still complaining that they didn't want to go across the Schuylkill to go to church. I don't know about whether there was a dock or not. It's a good question.
So Jim or Michael,
I
is
could-
your understanding, do you have any idea about the dock?
Well, in the 1600s, I'm sorry, in the 1600s, I doubt that there might have been a small dock, but there was probably still somewhat of an inlet next to the church where the creek that goes under Christian Street flowed into the Delaware. Supposedly there was, and it was accessible to boats, so boats could just go into that, sheltered from the river, and perhaps they had a small dock or something, or a landing there. Then that was eventually filled in, and Swanson Street started off as a breakwater, along the Delaware. And from there, they might have, had a small dock or a place where boats could moor. But in the by the mid 18th century, there were wharves going out into the Delaware just opposite the church. But I don't know that the church itself actually owned any there. They were for general commercial purposes at that time.
And the other thing is, after 1703, of course, there was a congregation in Swedesboro, in Raccoon. So all those people who had gone to Gloria Dei by boat after 1703 wouldn't need to do that anymore. So they wouldn't have had as much need.
Okay. Jim, anything to add in your studies about the development of Philadelphia?
No, I think Michael covered it.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I do have, that's all of our questions for the moment from our audience. So again, you're encouraged to put your questions in, and so I'm happy to ask our experts. But let's ask Jim a question. Jim, I know you're very well versed in William Penn. So what was William Penn's relationship with Gloria Dei Church?
Well, it was good with Gloria Dei Church, and I think with the Swedes in general. He appeared to like the Swedes, and they appeared to like him. I know that George Boudreau talks about the fact that William Penn, Gloria Dei Church is probably the oldest surviving building in Philadelphia that William Penn ever entered. So it was special to him. And as I said, his town was only 2 musket shots away. And I know that he was friendly with one of the pastors,
Rudman.
Rudman.
Rudman, yeah.
And I know that he lived nearby, and I understand they actually walked together. So it seemed that they had a good relationship. I do know that the Swedes, when they came, were a little bit looked askance at what they called all the fanatics that were here because of the freedom of religion. They said there were all these people that were very different in their thinking, and they were fanatical. And I think we still are.
Kim, Eric, is there anything you want to add about William Penn's relationship with Pastor Rudman?
Yeah, that was interesting, because one of the things that Rudman told Penn was that the Swedes had all been cheated by the Quakers. And that probably was true, but it was also true that the Swedes were very lackadaisical about the borders for their properties. And when the tax bills came, the Swedes yelled and screamed about how much land they had lost and they had always had, and went on and on and on. And there was so much complaining about this that Rudman went and talked to William Penn about it. And Penn agreed that probably the naive, illiterate Swedes had been taken for a ride a couple of times by the more sharp businessmen who came from England. And so he set aside land up on the Schuylkill at Mattapony, what's now Douglasville, for the Swedes who felt that they had been cheated by the Sharpies who came with Penn. And that seemed to make everyone happy, especially Rudman, who got a nice piece of land up there himself.
And don't we have naturalization papers
Yes.
that Penn signed for Rudman to make him an American citizen?
Yes, signed by William Penn.
Mhm.
So many of the Swedish pastors who came either died or went home, but Rudman's wife was very much feeling that she didn't want to leave the country. And Rudman realized that, and so he became a naturalized citizen of Pennsylvania.
Very nice. Okay. All right. Amy and Michael, how did the neighborhood of Queen Village get its name, and what was it called before?
Okay, Michael, do you want to start with what it was called before?
Go ahead.
Well, the area was originally a Lenape settlement that was called Wickako, which means pleasant place. And when the Swedes arrived, they continued to use that name. As a matter of fact, I think that the church was called the Wickako Church. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, very often.
Yeah. So when William Penn came in 1682, he renamed the area Southwark because it reminded him of Southwark in England on the Thames. So that the area was called that for a very long time, up until, I think until the 1960s. So the lore about one of these things that we run into is that sometimes some story is told and it gets repeated and repeated and repeated, and then it winds up being in the public consciousness so much so that nobody fact checks it. So in the case of the name of Queen Village, I had taken for granted, I mean, I've lived in Queen Village for 20 years. I had taken for granted this idea, the story that that Queen Village was named in honor of Queen Christina of Sweden, who was the queen when the Swedes arrived in 1638. But the story is actually more complicated than that. Essentially, what happened was the neighborhood went into decline after World War II. Manufacturing jobs had moved away. The piers along the Delaware River were not being used anymore because of the containerization of cargo. So people started leaving the area. And at the same time, the federal government started redlining areas in the country so that banks wouldn't give out mortgages. So our neighborhood was redlined. And what that meant is that people couldn't buy a house, right? So they would leave. So also in 1957, a further blow to all this was that city planners announced that they were going to erect 2 expressways in South Philadelphia, I-95 running through the Front Street corridor, and then the Crosstown Expressway, which would have gone down South Street. Now the Crosstown Expressway didn't happen, but I-95 obviously did. So, I mean, all of these things combined, people stopped investing in housing in the neighborhood. Housing was abandoned. The housing stock, we have a beautiful housing stock in Queen Village, a lot of 18th and 19th century buildings that were just blighted at that time. So this leads me to how we get to the name. In 1962, a bunch of concerned neighbors gathered with the pastors of Gloria Dei Church, the St. Philip Neri Catholic Church. There were 4 other congregations in the area that were involved in this. And they started to think about how they could revitalize the neighborhood. And what they decided to do was form a nonprofit organization that would buy this housing stock, renovate it, and then sell it to moderate and lower income families. So that's what they did. They formed this nonprofit. They renovated a lot of houses. They didn't make any money on this venture, mind you, but it spurred other people to start reinvesting in the neighborhood. So what was this organization called? Queen Village Inc. And how did they get this name? Well, this is the part where it gets complicated. So back in 2018, I was working on an article about Queen Village Inc. I was really fascinated by this idea that the community gathered together and saved this neighborhood, right? So I interviewed a bunch of people who were around at that time and said, okay, so what's the story? Is it named for Queen Christina? You know, they all told me different stories. Not one was the same. And what was so strange about this is that they were all in the same meeting where this name was selected, right? So yeah, so this is fascinating to me. So I started digging into resources because obviously the oral history wasn't going to cut it, right? So in 1966, there was an article in the Sunday and Evening Bulletin where the claim in this article, now mind you, without sources, this is just a claim, was that Catherine, Queen, and Christian streets were all named for Queen Christina, right? Stated as fact, 1966. And then in 1976, this book, which is by Paul Levy, it's Queen Village, The Eclipse of Community, which is very specifically about the Queen Village Inc. nonprofit. In that, somebody recounts this story. And I'll read it to you because it's interesting. So it says, I recall Father John Fee of St. Philip Neri saying, I think we need a name. This may come as a bit of surprise to some of you that a good papist like me would talk about a Protestant queen, but the Swedes did get here first, and we have Queen Street, Christian Street, and Catherine Street. And it was Queen Catherine of Sweden, and I wonder how you all might feel about calling this venture Queen Village. And we all said, we'll drink to that. And we threw our hats into the air and said, let's call it Queen Village, right? So there are a couple problems with this. The queen was not named Catherine. I think they were referring to Queen Christina, right? And all this. But then, you know, Queen Christina, she abdicated the throne, I think, in 1654, something like that, right? So she wasn't ruling, I think, when this area starts to be settled, which is, I can't think of the date. Michael, do you remember when Sven got?
It was 1646, I think. That's Sven Gunnarsson. No, 1654. It was before that. Yeah, that's right. Right.
Okay, so we're talking a little bit of a time passing, and then, but I think perhaps more importantly, when we look at the development of the neighborhood, we've got the city of Philadelphia to the north, which has a very specific grid plan for streets laid out by William Penn. And then south of South Street, which is the area we're talking about, was probably still farmland. It didn't have necessarily defined streets until much, much later. From what we could tell, the east-west streets in the neighborhood probably weren't created until 1740, 1750, 1760s. And that's 90 years after Queen Christina's rule, right? So do these streets have Swedish origins? According to Peter Stevens Craig, who was the longtime historian of the Swedish Colonial Society, Christian Street, he says, was named for Christian Keen, who was the wife of Christopher Swanson. Christopher Swanson was the grandson of Sven Gunnarsson and would have inherited some of his grandfather's land, right? So if that's really true, that kind of makes sense. It's named after a contemporary person from the time. Catherine Street perhaps is named after another Swanson. There were certainly Catherine Swansons. Queen Street, I'm not so sure about what the origins of that are, but most English towns that we know of have a King Street and a Queen Street, so and we had a
Sure.
King at the time. Yeah. So that could be it. I mean, we don't have a definitive answer about this, but it's just that the time passing between Queen Christina and when these streets are developed, it's a 90+ year gap, So anyway, back to this party. Well, I'm going to call it a party now, where there's nonprofits trying to come up with a name. Apparently, this is one of the anecdotes I was told when I was looking into this. One member of the group had just moved to Philadelphia from New York City. And in New York, he lived in Queens, and he was talking about how there was a hip area called the Village. So according to his anecdote, he suggested Queen Village because it would be a hip branding strategy for this nonprofit. And apparently they all drank to that too. So I think that the reason why there are all these different stories is because they were all sitting there probably throwing out really great ideas, converged on this one, and ultimately it's come to be about Queen Christina, in the popular press, which is not a bad thing because it's acknowledging the Swedish roots of the area. So that's my take on the name.
That's more fascinating than I expected.
Well, it's just, the kinds of things that come up. You get into a research rabbit hole, right? of looking into stuff. And that's where that led me a couple of years ago. So
Anyone else want to weigh in on that topic?
Well, of course,
Right, sure.
if the Roman Catholic priest had suggested it, that would make perfect sense, because Christina became Roman Catholic and
Right.
established her palace, in the Vatican, and was seen as a queen and as a reigning monarch there when she left Sweden. So she would relate also to the present Italian population in Queen Village.
Yeah, you're right. So I think it's a combination of things, I think they were
Amy,
just
I have
like
a
you said, they were drinking, having a
Amy?
good time. Yeah.
Go ahead, Jim.
The Catherines that you were talking about, were they spelled? Because I was surprised that Catherine is spelled with an A. I had initially misspelled it in my book, and my son, I walk by it all the time, and I didn't notice that it wasn't Catherini. And is Arini a common name?
Yeah. Yeah. I think Catherine Swanson, the one who married Anthony Duché, who's buried in our churchyard, on her gravestone, it's spelled with an A. When did she die? I'm trying to remember. We kind of speculated that maybe the Catherine
was
Street was named for her.
1752, something like that. Yeah, it was
Right.
much.
Well, that's around the time that these streets were starting to be, developed. So, I kind of like the idea it's named for her, Catherine Street. Again, don't know if that's true. That's the kind of thing, we'll probably stumble upon at some point when we look into a deed trail, that maybe somebody will mention a new street called Catherine, named for so-and-so. But so far I haven't run into it.
Well, in various maps, as far as the spelling, I've seen it spelled both ways on old maps, with the E or with an A. But I think the A, as far as a name, at least in that era, was more common.
I have a question for Kim Eric. So during the work on the colonial records of the Swedish churches in Pennsylvania, was there something that was particularly surprising about Gloria Dei that you learned during that process?
Well, I think one of the things is, there were a lot of ups and downs. So if people are worried now, look to the past, where things were worse. A number of times they were. One was the time when the Moravians were kind of fanatical and grabbing any person who moved and taking a lot of members out of Gloria Dei Church, because the pastor then wasn't very popular. And of course, when they built the other part of Christ Church, when St. Peter's was built and they had English services, a whole bunch of people decided that Swedish was old-fashioned and they weren't going to bother with that anymore. So that was another bunk to the congregation. And the third one, which was the worst, was the revolution, because it was actually closed for 3 years. The building was closed and there was no worship there. So they had to survive during all of this time, especially during the revolution, because the pastor was mentally unstable, had questionable English, and was a Tory. So he had 3 strikes against him, plus he was unpopular. So how did the congregation survive? It would not have survived if it hadn't been for the fact that Karl Magnus Wrangel had started an annex in West Philadelphia, St. James. So they were able to all go back across the Schuylkill the other way and worship on Sundays at St. James. So that was the only way the congregation survived. Amazing.
Thank you. Let's see, for Amy and Michael, how did the church and the neighborhood participate in the Civil War?
You want me to take a stab at that, Amy? Well, I don't know actually if the church had a a direct role or any more than or less than other congregations. The neighborhood of working people around the church was, at least leading up to the war, as I recall, not all that sympathetic to the issues that really lay behind the Civil War of Black emancipation. As people might know, in some years earlier, there were even riots, anti-Black riots by nativists in the neighborhood who feared basically that the growing Black population would compete for jobs along the waterfront and so forth. And Philadelphia as a whole was rather racist in those days. There was a great deal of Southern sympathies through many walks of life here in the city, which kind of changed once Fort Sumter was fired upon. Then there was a rush of patriotism, to defend the Union and so forth. So one of the centers of that, you might say, that mobilization towards the war was right at the doorstep of the church, because troops coming from further north would take the railway across New Jersey. Some came up the Delaware, and they would disembark right at the foot of Washington Avenue there, and then they would march towards the railway station at Broad and what is now Washington Avenue, Prime Street, to go further south to the battlefront. So right here, there were hospitality buildings for the troops. There was one just right on the corner of where the church was. It was called the Cooper Shop room, because it was a former cooperage, a barrel maker shop. And there was a lunchroom there and so forth for the troops. And then just right across the street, I guess about where I-95 goes by, or where the, what is it, a Dunkin' Donuts or something there now, little shopping center, was the Union Center there with clinics and so forth. And so you had thousands and thousands of troops going right through, and some, sticking around, getting a nice hot meal, and there were dormitory space and so forth right where the church was. So I don't really know, and perhaps Kim Eric or others know more, exactly how the church being there might have appealed to all those troops that were in its vicinity. And I'll leave it to others to answer in more detail than that.
Okay. Is there anything you would like to add, Jim, to that in your studies?
Not really. I thought Michael did it very well. I'm assuming that any industry here in the Queen Village area would have done well because Philadelphia was a major supporter of the Civil War, and actually Philadelphia did quite well financially from what I've read as a result of all the factories and things that we had here. So I would assume things were quite busy in Philadelphia and in Queen Village during the Civil War.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, of course, the Navy Yard was still right across the street, across Federal Street, just south of the church. And a lot of the workers, I would assume, who worked in the Navy Yard were parishioners at the church, as well as some of the seamen, Navy sailors and so forth.
Nice. Okay, great. I have a question for Kim Eric. I guess maybe, well, you did tell us about the revolution, so I'm going to go to a different one. In 1766, Gloria Dei's pastor, Carl Magnus Wrangel, noted that a great number of Swedish descendants in this city who by diversified fatalities have lost the Swedish language. And it sounds like this might have been a crisis for the church. And if it was, how did the church adapt?
Well, rather poorly and too slowly, as often happens in religion. When you're dealing with the truth, you go slowly. And of course, the Church of Sweden felt the only point of sending priests from Sweden to America was to serve people who spoke Swedish, and nobody in Sweden spoke English. And it was very difficult to find any candidate who even wanted to learn English, because Sweden was primarily aligned culturally with Germany. And they all knew German and they all knew French, but English was just a puzzle to them. So when people began to really need English, it became difficult to find a candidate. Luckily, Wrangel was a brilliant person. He could preach in German, Swedish, and English. Just by walking in the door, he would change language. So it wasn't a problem for him, and he decided that he would just ignore the archbishop's arguments about doing everything in Swedish and just do everything in English, which is what he did, because he realized the time had come and there was really no choice to do that. And really, after him, there was never any return to Swedish. And
he was the last one.
Yeah, he did very little in Swedish. In fact, the two annex congregations that he founded, one in Bridgeport, Christ Church in Upper Marion, and then St. James in West Philadelphia and Kings Hessing. In both of those, only English was used. So the writing was already clearly on the wall. And of course, he did write a book in English for young people, where he summarized Luther's Small Catechism. So he was clearly aware that this was what you had to do.
Okay, great. Well, our audience members have not been sending us any more questions. And I am through the ones that we had prepared. Are there any comments from our panel members that, you would like to share? Any sort of follow-ups or other thoughts? We have about 10 minutes before we wind up.
I have a question for Kim Eric, if I may. I began reading the latest volumes of the Blue Books, and at the beginning, there's a contribution by Wrangel, I think it is the first one, and then by what's his name? Gore. How do you pronounce it?
Göransson. Göransson. The G is like a Y. Göransson.
Jorgensen, okay.
Yeah,
And I was trying to figure out what you might say is the subtext behind it. Jorgensen speaks about his illness, physical illness that from the boat trip, across the ocean and that kind of thing. And then he says they put him in a straitjacket. And I understand, I seem to remember, and in talking with Amy, that there was a lot of dissension, first with Wrangel, and then there was some business with Jorgensen also, but it wasn't entirely clear to me. So I was wondering if you could tell us some more about that.
Yeah, this is a big topic. We can easily use up to 10 minutes on this, that's for sure.
Oh, I think it's juicy material and you should tell us.
Well, Carl Magnus Wrangel is a very interesting person. He was a genius. He was charismatic. He was vain. He was prideful. He was brilliant. And his followers loved him, and those who didn't like him hated him. So he did not leave people without an opinion. And as soon as he got off the boat, he was in trouble in Philadelphia. And one of the reasons he was in trouble was he had been appointed dean of the Swedish congregations. That meant he got an extra salary. It also meant he could call the meetings of all the pastors and preside at them and tell them what was what and what was going to happen. So he got the appointment to be dean and the salary over the pastors who were here, who were clearly expecting to be appointed dean. In addition to the fact he came from one of the most respected noble families in Sweden. It was like saying that the pastor was, Zuckerberg, here he comes, or, Rockefeller. So already people who were not in the upper class were doubtful about this nobleman coming. And in Sweden, he was such a profound orator that he had been elected to be one of the king's court preachers before he was even ordained. And when he got to Germany, he wasn't there very long till the German authorities decided at Göttingen that he should get his doctorate quickly because Sweden was a political ally and that would make the Swedes happy. So he had quite a reputation when he finally arrived. And he also came with a lot of new ideas. He was a pietist. Some of the other pastors were very conservative and they weren't into new things and they didn't want a lot of emotion going on. And so there was all sorts of conflicts. Why Jorgensen comes as his supposedly assistant and supposed to be the one to take over. And what happened to Jorgensen, we don't have the psychological and medical information to tell. But as soon as he got there, he had, it looks like, a nervous breakdown. And then he accused Wrangel of not taking care of him and trying to really get rid of him. And we're not sure who to believe in all this. Wrangel said he did everything to make sure that he got better. Well, it's a very difficult time. Jorgensen also was not gifted linguistically, so it took him a very long time to learn English. And that did not endear him to what the congregation had become, which was entirely English speaking. I mean, every Sunday was Book of Common Prayer. You didn't use anything in Swedish. So here was this foreigner who was mentally unstable, who didn't speak very good English and wasn't all that convincing. So there was lots of fights. And in 7A and 7B, you see them between the pastor in New Jersey, Johann Wicksell, who was very conservative, and he hated Wrangel with a passion and tried like crazy to get rid of him. Of course, he wanted to be dean and wasn't. So he was missing out on the salary. And then, of course, the king asked Wrangel to come back, and he named another pastor to be the dean. And Wrangel would not read the letter because the other pastor had been accused of pastoral misconduct in Wilmington, D.C. and Wrangel believed it was true. Nobody knew whether it was true or not, but he said we can't have a dean who has pastoral misconduct hanging over his head. So all this is going on in the meantime. So, I mean, if this isn't enough, and then you have a revolution, I mean, how can any congregation survive with all of that stuff? And finally, Wrangel is forced really to go home after saying he wants to go home. He doesn't want to go home. He's going to go home. He's not going to go home. He can't speak enough English, or maybe he'll learn English. So it really is. You just read this over and over, back and forth. All these subtexts are going on. One of the subtexts, of course, is class. You know, the nobility versus the middle class. Some of it is resentment. Some of it is the fact that he is such a great orator. I mean, his Bible class at Gloria Dei was so popular in English that he had to move it out of Gloria Dei and move it up to St. Michael's German Lutheran Church, which was 3 times as big, and he filled that.
Mhm.
So the other pastors were outraged, you know, at this kind of popularity and this success, you know. So all of this you read in 7a and 7b, going back and forth, you know, these conflicts back and forth.
Very nice. Well, you're right. That did take us to our closing time. Any other final comments? This has been really fascinating. It's this will be available on video, a recording of this, so we'll be able to add that to our website for those who couldn't join us tonight. And I think Amy will want to promote this in our newsletter because it really has been a fascinating conversation. So many thanks to all of you, Jim, Michael, Kim Eric, thank you so much. Amy, really appreciate it. So is there any other last words? Otherwise, I'll end our broadcast.
Nope.
Nope,
Good night.
okay. Thank you all. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Take care.